All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I'm having microphone problems, so I had to go to my secondary mic, so sorry if the sound's a little light. I'm going over the PowerPoint slides for Vodnik and Gosseling's JavaScript 6th edition, the Web Warrior series. I'm up to Chapter 5. Chapter 5, as we see here, is on the DOM, or Document Object Model. We've got about 6 or 7 objectives here. We want to be able to access elements by ID, which is the most important out of the ones shown there, but also by tag name, class name, or selector. Access element content, CSS properties, and attributes. Add and remove what are referred to as document nodes. Create and close browser tabs and windows within an app. Use set timeout and set interval methods to specify a delay or a duration. Use the history, location, navigation, and screen objects to manipulate the browser window. JavaScript treats a web page content. Everything that's on it is a series of components or objects. So every element is an object. Not only that, every one of those objects that you give an ID to, all right, you can manipulate programmatically. You can create your own objects while the page is running. So you can have content appear, disappear, change, etc. as a program is running. A function can also be used as an object. And if we haven't seen that yet, and actually we have, but we will, and we'll continue to. Now, we talked a little very quickly when I started this about the DOM, or the Document Object Model. There's also a BOM. The BOM is the Browser Object Model. All right, and as it says, it's also known as the Client-Side Object Model. It's a hierarchy of objects that are available to you on a web page. Each provides programmatic access. This is where the interactivity comes in JavaScript. All right, for instance, there is the window object. The window object represents a browser window. It's known as the global object because, as you'll see in the next slide, everything else is contained below it. So the window object contains a history object, a location object, a navigator object, a screen object, and a document object. And it's that document object that is the document object model. That's where most of the work takes place. The DOM, or Document Object Model, is a hierarchical listing of all your web page elements that gets built for you automatically when you create the web page. As mentioned here, it represents the web page displayed in the browser, all of the web page elements. JavaScript represents each element by its own object. So even though technically in virtually everything we've done thus far, we're using JavaScript more in an object-based and not an object-oriented way, we're still doing object-oriented code. All right. For years, the rage was dynamic HTML, or DHTML. And as it says, that's where the interaction can change content of a web page without reloading. It's a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And as we'll see later, it can also be jQuery. It can change the presentation of content. All right, the DHTML over time has kind of morphed into the DOM. The DOM is an example of an API, or Application Programming Interface. Now, if you've never heard of API before, you've been using them. I look at an API, this is me speaking, not a textbook. I look at the API as being like a contract. I'm under contract to Rankin Technical College. I have agreed to perform a service. I have agreed to perform a service in a certain way. And for that, they have agreed to compensate me. All right? In much the same way, when you work with an application program interface, it's like a contract. Whereas there is software that's been pre-written that gives you the ability to do certain things. However, you must do the certain things in the manner in which you are supposed to do them. So again, the DOM is an example of an API. The DOM is a structure of objects, and each of these objects has its own properties and methods. So if we had a web page that looked like this, all right, so in your body you've got a header, and the header has got an H1 tag in it. Then you've got an article tag, and that article, right now, all it has in it is a figure. Well, it doesn't look like much, but this is the document object model, or the DOM tree, that's been built from that. The document object is at the top, but kind of the root, so to speak, is HTML. HTML has two direct descendants. A head, which has a meta tag, a title tag. The meta tag has char set attribute. The title tag is photo gallery. And you'll notice the title, that's text. Char set is an attribute, and everything else that we've talked about thus far is an element, or a DOM element. The body has a header and an article. The header has an H1 tag. The H1 tag has the text garden photo. The article tag has a figure tag. The figure tag has a fig caption with the text butterfly bush. The figure tag also has an image element that has a source attribute and an alt attribute. Again, any of these elements that you see, so any of this stuff that's here in white, you can conceivably give it an ID and manipulate it programmatically. So each item that we see right here is referred to, each item in the DOM tree is a node. All right? All the nodes that you see that are at the bottom are known as leaf nodes. Most of your leaf nodes are going to end up being either a text node or an attribute node, as they are in this case. So again, element, attribute, and text nodes are the types that are used most often. Now, this is maybe the key slide in the chapter. We've talked about some of this stuff already, but definitely the one for you to understand more than any of the rest in here is the first one. Get element by ID. First thing, notice that not the first one, but the second, third, and fourth, these all say get elements, get elements, get elements. But get element is singular. It allows you to grab one of these elements by its ID and then manipulate it programmatically. If you need to grab a whole bunch of things, so maybe I need to grab everything with a class of hello, then it would be get elements by class name and then in parentheses hello. All right, I can work with a regular name, not used as often. I can work by tag name. Okay, and as you'll see later as we go on, query selector all returns a collection of elements that match whatever you're looking for. And writes text to a document. So, what do we have? Here's some of the object properties. We've got the body. That's everything within the body tag. Cookie. A cookie is basically a small piece of, it's a small text file up to 4K in length that typically the server writes to the browser's machine. If you've ever gone out to Amazon, for example, and you bought a book, then maybe the next time you come out there, Amazon has got recommendations based on that book you just bought. And that's done through cookies. Sometimes you go out to a website and they might ask, what is your favorite color? Then they make the background color of the website that color. That's a cookie. The domain is the domain name of the server where the current document is located. Last modified is the date, literally, that the file was or document was last modified. Location is the locale of the current document, including the URL. The referrer, that's how you got to the current document that you're at. The title is what's specified in the title element, and the URL is the URL of the current document. The biggest method that you use that's part of the document object, again, is get element by ID. This is case sensitive. Everything that you see in there is lowercase except the E in element, the first E, the B in by, and the I in ID. I've mentioned this before, but if you say get elements by ID with an S, won't work. If you say get element by ID and the E is not capitalized, will not work. Or if the B is not capitalized, will not work. or if the D at the end here is capitalized. Will not work. There are several methods available in JavaScript to reference web page elements. So if we've got a web page and we stick a number field on there that says zip, and we want to reference that programmatically, we can say var and give it a name, document.getElementById, and that zip that you see right here is that zip that's right here. That's the ID. So we're getting that element by its ID. You can get multiple elements by the name of their tag. Notice it returns an array of elements. It returns what's typically referred to as a node list, which is an index collection of nodes. In other words, it's basically the objects. All right? The HTML collection is indexed, an index collection of HTML elements, and as it says, it uses the array syntax, where numbers start with 0. Get elements by class name returns a node list of an HTML collection of elements with a class name that matches some kind of an attribute. So that would be the name of a class side. It can take multiple values. The best way to learn this, other than reading your book and hopefully other than listening to this lecture, is to go out to the W3 School site, the w3schools.com site, and start searching for different things. Arguments enclosed in single quotes with the class name are separated by spaces. All right, here is an example. So here we're grabbing all elements with a class of both side and a class of green. You can use get elements by name. Notice returns a list of nodes or an HTML collection of elements with a name attribute that specifies that value. It's not used as much. The query selector, as it says, it references elements using CSS syntax. It returns the first occurrence of an element that matches what you're looking for. I'm not going to worry about IE8. You shouldn't be using it anyway. The query selector all method, as mentioned here, returns a collection of elements that matches a selector. It's different from query selector. Query selector only returns the first occurrence. Query selector all returns every occurrence. So if I asked here for all of the LIs under a UL under the nav, and if I used query selector, I would just get the first one, about us. If I use query selector all, I'd get all three. So I'd get the LI for about us, the LI for order, and the LI for support. Text content property, as it says here, it accesses and changes text that an element contains. But unlike inner HTML, if you do have any HTML in it, it strips it out. So it gives you just text, the text content. It's considered more secure because sometimes people can put nasty stuff inside of HTML tags, or at least attempted to. You access CSS properties using the DOM through what are called the dot syntax. So what I'm saying is I want you to find the ID of logo, and I want you to apply a CSS style to it, that style being a display of none. So in other words, that would make it invisible. When CSS encounters a property with a hyphen in it, like font family, you remove the hyphen, excuse me, you remove the hyphen, and the first letter that follows the hyphen is capitalized. So font hyphen family becomes font family with a capital F. CSS value specified using a DOM reference is an inline style, so it's basically the highest in the CSS hierarchy as far as what gets used first. To remove a style, so if I wanted to remove the color from something with an ID of navbar, I'd set it equal to the empty string. Get used to, when you're using the empty string, use double quote, don't use single quote, single quote. I'm not saying you can't get it to work, but in virtually every other programming language, single quotes and double quotes mean something different. A single quote typically means a single character, where a double quote means a string. Since you want the empty string, please get used to using double quote, with no space in it for the empty string. All right. As far as accessing element attributes, another example. So what I'm doing here is I'm referencing the home link ID. I'm grabbing that element. Then if I want to grab its href, I have to add another dot on the end. Or I can take this and put it into a variable and then use the variable name .href. One exception is mentioned here for accessing element attributes. You must use the property name class name to refer to class attribute names. Notice that a single class value is returned just like anything else. Multiple class values are returned as a single string that is space separated. If you want to be able to add things to the DOM, all right, that's referred to as adding nodes to the DOM. You can both add new nodes to a DOM, you can remove existing nodes from a DOM, and you can update existing elements in the DOM. So what that's saying is while your program is running, you can change the content by adding new content, modifying existing content, or deleting existing content. To create new content, you use the create element method. Document.createElement, and you give it a name. So this would create a new div element. Now it creates it, but after you create it, it's kind of out there in purgatory. So when you first create a new DOM node, it's not automatically appended to the DOM itself. In order to create a new DOM node and then append it to the DOM itself, you must use the append child method. As mentioned here, the append child method attaches a node to the DOM tray. The child node is the node to be attached, and the parent node is where you want to attach it, for lack of better words. So let's look at the example here. The idea is to create a new li element and attach it to an element that's called navlist. So this creates the new element right here. I'm sorry. This grabs the navlist element, and it's going to call it list. This creates a new li element. This appends that new li element to here. All right. A document fragment is a set of document nodes that are not part of a document. You can use the append child to add document fragments to a DOM tree for a document. This picture may look a little bit confusing, but what it's doing is it's showing you what happens in these lines right here. And the bottom line is when you get done, okay, when you finish, you're going to end up having a new li tag. Now maybe I'm wrong here, I guess, but it's showing you another way that this can be done. All right. So it's showing you ways that you can add things to the DOM. So I guess here what they're doing is they're grabbing and they're adding a new figure here, and they're adding an image to the figure. So what you have here are a div, 3 figures, 2 divs, and another figure. So what they've added here is what they're adding here, and they're showing you how to add it there. Sometimes it might be too much work. It's possible, as an example, that you want to take something that's already on a web page and make a copy of it. Okay? In order to do that, if you want to take one of these document objects and you want to make a copy of it, you want to make what's called a clone of it. So you create a new node that's the exact same as the existing node. And you do that using the clone node method. And again, they're showing you an example here. So maybe I've got a single li element in a list, and I want to make copies of it, so I can eventually go in. I can change the text in it later. That's not a big thing. But I can take one element, copy it, make 10 copies. Now I've got a list with 11 elements in it, for example. By default, when you insert something in a document object model and you tell it, the parent to insert it into, it goes at the bottom. Remember that when you create a new node with create element, it's not automatically attached to the document tree. You need append child. And it appends it after what's in there. So it puts it on the end. If you want to put it in a different position, you use the insert before method. So as an example, I've got here about us, order, and support. And I want to go and add to this directions. And if I say that where I want to add it is before about us, normally you would have about us, then order, then support, and directions would be added to it. So normally it'd be this, 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 and your new one would go on the end. But since you're saying insert it before about us, it now goes at the beginning. So if you use the insert before command, it gives you the ability to put something in whatever position you want to put it in. Well, you don't just want to insert nodes. Eventually, you may want to remove nodes. And be careful, remove nodes, removes nodes, or removes a node. It's remove node. It removes a node from the DOM tray. And it's remove node, and they show you the syntax there. You can assign remove node to a variable, so you still have access to it. So if you're about to remove something, in case later you decide you want to put it back or whatever. So the node, if you remove a node and you don't assign it to a variable, JavaScript, like Java, like a lot of other languages, has a low-level operating system job, for lack of better words, that runs that's called the garbage collector. And if you've got a node that you've removed and you didn't stick it into any variable, eventually the garbage collector comes around and it'll remove that or delete that variable. All right. Manipulating the browser with the window object. Let me mention here, I'm going to go through the majority of these slides, if not all of them. Then I'm going to go back into W3 Schools and show you some of their examples for using the DOM, because so far we just looked at the we've just looked here at the PowerPoints. We got to do more than that. All right. So the window object, as mentioned, includes properties containing information about the browser window or the tab. And there are methods that allow you to do manipulation with this. I'm not going to read these. You can take a look at them. So anything that's in here, you can conceivably manipulate programmatically. Here are some of these are the properties. These are the methods. Alert, we're familiar with. If I'm on a web page and I'm on a field and I click off that field onto another field, the field that I was originally on has a blur method that runs. The method that I just clicked to has a focus method that runs. All right. These intervals and timeouts, we're going to talk about what an interval is and what a timeout is in just a little bit. But if you set an interval or you set a timeout and you want those to be turned off, you run clear interval or clear timeout. You can use close to close a window or to close a tab. Confirm does what you think it would do, displays a confirm dialog box. Move by allows you to move a window typically relatively, and move to moves it absolutely. Open can be used to open up a new browser window or a new tab. Print can be used to print the current document. And prompt displays a dialog box. You've already seen prompt. All right. There's some resizing methods, some scrolling methods, and we already mentioned the opposite of clear interval and clear timeout is set interval and set timeout. All right. This gets a little bit confusing because sometimes in JavaScript, when you want to refer to something that's currently active, you use this. But in the case right here, we use self. So self refers to the current window object. So the two things that they show in that first set of bullets there, window.close and self.close, either can be used. Again, the advantage of using self.close is a little less typing. It's considered good practice to always say window dot or self dot, whether it's needed or not. Now, not everybody, just because something is good practice, that does not mean that necessarily everybody does it. All right. Why would you want to open up a new web browser window? Well, one, to launch a new web page in a separate window. Two, you might want to use an additional window to display information, maybe legal information or whatever. So when a new browser window is open, automatically a new window object is created representing that new window. And here's a way that you can do it. The open method, as it says, opens new windows. After you've opened them, you can resize them, you can scroll in and out of them, you can set intervals or timeouts in them. So again, include all or none of those method arguments. Here they're including nothing other than the window. You're saying open a new window and you're saying what to put in it. As mentioned here, you can customize a new browser window or tab appearance using the options that are shown here. Notice if you use window.open and if what you put inside for your target is a name that's already being used, then rather than creating a new window, the web browser instead changes the focus from the window you're currently at to the new window. The name property is used to specify the target window with a link. As it says, it cannot be used in JavaScript code. The focus method can be used to make the window active. The close method can be used to close it. So again, when you do that, you should say window.close or self.close if the current window is the one that you want to close. If it's not the current one, it should be the name that you used for that .close. All right, timeouts and intervals. The difference between a timeout and an interval, I don't know if any of you have an alarm clock like this, but back in the days before we had clock radios, you had an alarm clock that you typically wound up. That's how it was powered. Not electric, but it was you wound it, you clicked it, all right, turned the handle until you couldn't anymore. All right? And then the idea was that thing would ring and there was no snooze button on it. As soon as you turn it off, boom, the alarm was off. That's like setting a timeout. So if I set a timeout with an old-fashioned alarm clock for 7 o'clock and it goes off at 7 o'clock and I turn it off, it's a one and done. That's a set timeout. So a set timeout method in JavaScript will execute code at a specific time. It executes only once, and we'll take a look at it in more depth in just a minute. If you don't want the timeout anymore, you call clear timeout. So maybe I've got the alarm set for 7 o'clock, but I wake up and it's 6:50, and I know I'm not going to get back to sleep in 10 minutes. I'm not going to get 10 minutes worth of sleep, so I turn the alarm off before it's even rung. So that's a clear timeout. So I've canceled it before it's executed. So here's some examples. Here's setting a timeout, and here's clearing that timeout. Interval is more like the way it is today. With, if I don't do this, but I know that I've got a brother that used to have a clock radio. It would go off at 5 in the morning. He'd hit the snooze button and it would go off in 9 minutes. He'd hit snooze again and it would go off in 9 minutes. So what he was doing was he was setting an interval, basically, saying I want you to go off every 9 minutes. That's what the set interval does. So it will repeatedly execute the same JavaScript code. It's only called once, but then you're saying that every number of seconds or every number of whatever, run the code again. So again, if I've hit snooze twice and now I turn off the alarm, that's like a clear interval. We've got a history object, and that's a browser history. So it maintains an internal list or a history list of all documents that have been opened during the current web browser session. It says security features will not display URLs contained in the history list. You can't do much with it. You can go backwards, you can go forwards, or you can go to a specific page. So if I wanted to see, if I knew that I'd been to 57 sites and for some reason I knew that the site I wanted to go to was number 34, I could do a go and basically give it that number and go to that page. And I said, no, it's the one before that, I could do a back. Or if I said rather it's the one after that, I could do a forward. So the go method allows navigation to stuff you've looked at previously. The history object has a length property, which has the number of documents open in the current browser session. The location object, as it says, allows changes to a new web page from within JavaScript code. So if I want to be able to change my current page programmatically, I can use the location object. Here are the properties of the location object and the methods of the location object. The location object, as it says there, has an assign method, which is like changing the hypertext reference property. It'll load a new web page. It has a reload method, which is like pressing, refreshing the browser to cause the current page to open again. And it has a replace method, which replaces the currently loaded URL with a new one. The navigator object obtains information about a current web browser. Back in the day, this used to be known as browser sniffing, and it was very popular. So you can find out, for example, the type of browser that's using the web page, the version of that browser that's using the web page, etc. And if you wanted to, you could log that information to the console. For instance, Mozilla, I believe, typically means you're using Firefox. Notice you're using Windows. All right. The screen object, as mentioned, that gives you information about the current screen. It allows you to display the screen size, the resolution, the color depth. Notice a common use for this is centering a web page window in the middle of a display area. Here are the relevant properties of the screen object. Here is an example of using the screen object. And finally, that's it for the lecture part. So what I plan on doing is kind of twofold. I'm done with this lecture right now, but what I'm going to do, because we just talked about how to access, the big one again was get element by ID. We also talked about a few other ones. We talked about how to access content, CSS properties, and attributes. We talked about the remove node. We talked about the insert. I mentioned the differences between a timeout and an interval. We saw how to set and clear a timeout, how to set and clear an interval. And finally, we ended up by looking at the history, location, navigation, and screen objects for browser window manipulation. So that's it for Chapter 5. Before I go into Chapter 6, which is on form validation, I'm going to jump on over here, and I'm going to jump over to w3schools.com, and I want to look at DOM stuff that's in there. All right, so there's JavaScript HTML DOM, and there's HTML DOM objects. Let's look at both. So I'm going to open up that one. And I'm going to open up the JavaScript HTML DOM so we can take a look at both of those. So I'm going to come back and go through some of those examples in just a couple minutes.